All right, so let's talk about a term you may have heard thrown around, but you might not know exactly what it is. It's dynamic range. So back in the day when photography started, of course, we started with film where you would choose your ISO before you started shooting. So you would choose the sensitivity of your film, and then that film you could only shoot within a certain range or a certain set of lighting circumstances. For example, if you knew you were going to be outside in bright sun, then you would choose ISO 100 or 100 to 400 roughly to shoot outside in that sunny day. And within that sunny day, if you captured one image, it would be able to capture some of the highlights and some of the shadows. The higher the contrast situation, the less likely you would be able to capture all of those tones. So what do I mean exactly by that? This is the dynamic range of that film, or in this case, now we're using electronic sensors. So now we're talking about the dynamic range of the sensor. The dynamic range is the gamut of values that the sensor can capture in one image. So in this scene, we've set up a very high contrast scene. We have bright highlights and dark shadows because I have one direct light pointing at Janet and all of the things on the table. Now in this scene, we're not going to be able to adequately expose for both detail in all of our shadows and detail in all of our highlights. I can, of course, adjust my ISO, make it a little bit lower to get a little more detail in my highlights, or I can bring my ISO up and keep my shutter speed and aperture the same, and then get more detail in the shadow, as you can see is happening right here. But I'm losing detail in one of the two. Now, our sensors have a limitation here. They've been getting better. Every single generation is able to capture a wider range of tones. But typically, you may have to choose in a high contrast situation whether you want to capture the highlights in that scene or your shadows. And this is particularly useful and something you need to be aware of if, say, you're in a full sun situation and you have an object that is white and an object that is black. You're not going to be able to choose if you get detail in that black image and detail in the white image. You're going to have to choose one and sacrifice the other. Now, in film, you would typically overexpose your highlights and you would get the detail in your shadows, because when you were in the dark room, you could then change the way you were processing that image, and you could bring the detail of your highlights back in by doing something called burning. And we do have kind of digital manipulation techniques that are similar. But if you were to, say, expose those highlights correctly and lose all of your shadow details, there was no way to actually bring the shadows back. On an electronic camera, typically we're now exposing for the highlights, and then we can actually bring our shadows back. For just the way that they've made these sensors, it is much harder to recover really blown out highlights or where you've entirely overexposed your highlights. It's much easier to bring your shadows back up. And let me just show you what I mean by that. So we'll just take this one image here, and you can see in our camera we're losing a little bit of that, but then we can go into our shadow or our black setting, and we can then pull that up in our post-processing, where if we, let's say, instead expose for the shadows, and we're pushing, you can see that histogram, we're pushing those highlights up, we're overexposing it, but we are getting details in our blacks. Let's say in our next scene, now we already have the detail in our camera, but we've lost all of the detail here in the face of Janet. So even if we were to bring our highlights down and our whites down, we probably can't bring all of that detail back. You'll see this when you have a lighter client and they're in a high contrast situation and you start to get spots where the light is the brightest, hot spots. That's called being fully blown because you've lost all of the detail. There's no more skin texture there, and it's very, very hard to recover. You will have to actually put artificial texture in there if you want to correct that. And this is one of those times that I would say it's a technical rule. You do not want to blow and have hot spots in the highlights of your client. even with a darker toned skinned client, you can still have hot spots because you may have a sheen on the skin where you're seeing some highlights in that sheen. And even if you're exposing correctly for their darker skin tone, you actually in a high contrast situation can still blow the highlights in their skin. So it's something just to be aware of and to keep in mind when you're exposing in a high contrast situation. Now, if I were in full sun and I had no choice but to photograph that client in that lighting scenario, what I would end up doing is I would actually take them into shade, or I would try to create shade, or I would turn my clients back to the light and I would shoot them backlit. That would be my preference over photographing them in a lighting scenario like this, because I know the dynamic range of my sensor just can't handle it. And again, as generations go on and we get newer and more expensive bodies and the technology improves, our dynamic range is improving. But you can test this. You can test the limitations of your dynamic range by putting it in direct light, and you can see where your values fall that you're still able to recover. But in general, I would try to keep your subject in slightly softer situations unless it's very intentional, like you are trying to photograph a very fashion vibe where it's very graphic and you have dark shadows and high highlights, and that's part of the point. But again, the key is intentionality. So that's dynamic range. Again, it is another one of those topics that takes a little bit of time to internalize, to fully understand, and hands-on experience will also help you with this. So if you watch this lesson and you feel like you still have more questions, please do submit them in our AMA and I will dive into it again and try to explain.